and welcome to another episode of the Rollwise podcast, your show where we talk about things related to RPGs and the stuff adjacent. Lately, our little group of adventurers has been going through kind of an interesting experiment. An experiment where we're taking one single adventure, The Age of Worms, that was published back in the Dragon magazines back in 2004, 2005 era. And we are using them to run a campaign, or at least as long as our players are going. But we're converting the system between each of the, or converting the adventures between each of these different role playing systems that we're trying. So far, we have done this with DC 20. We've also done this with a game called Distal. These are both games that are in their alpha state right now. But it kind of inspired us to have a conversation about what does it take to convert adventures between systems, and should you do it? Should you not do it? Is it blasphemy? Work of the devil? All that kind of stuff. We'd actually be curious to hear, of course, what you guys have to say, but we're going to share some thoughts about that today. So, without further ado, let's get into converting adventures between systems. So, first and foremost, I think this is a really interesting topic because it there are some systems out there, and I'll use D&D as the most common one that has published modules for it, where people love a module, but it only existed in original D&D or AD&D or something like that. And they want to take that story and they want to extract the essence of it and put it into a different game. Have you guys really done much of that yourself? I know, Brent, you were more of a home brewer for the longest time, but have you ever played in one or kind of converted one yourself?
I've never really converted. I think you're probably going to find more the high fantasy adventures, like the classic D&D adventures.
Mm.
I've never done it myself. There's been some that I've planned to, or I had this grand designs that I think I would be interesting to do to transfer into a different system. But I don't know. The only one I've played in is what we're doing now. Other
Hmm.
than that, unless somebody did it and didn't tell me, which also is possible, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, they took a module that they converted and didn't tell me. That is possible.
And and to be fair, that's sometimes a DM trick is they're like, I don't think they know this story, so I'm going to borrow heavily from the components of the story and turn it into my own thing.
Well, I mean, that's pretty much anything. Like you do that with
Sure.
anything, like not just
Yeah,
modules.
if you're creating your own adventure for your players,
Mhm.
I mean, I think everything is free game, right? I have seen television show episodes adapted like for a home game. I've seen Shakespeare adapted for a home game loosely,
Mhm.
right? It's not a
I mean,
never
Shakespeare's adapted for
for
everything.
every well, yeah, most of the TV shows were probably adapted from
Yeah.
Shakespeare first.
There's a
So
lot of Hamlet. There's a
there's
lot
a,
of Hamlet floating out there.
there is, right? Sons of
Show,
Anarchy.
yeah, looking like that's exactly what I was thinking of. There's a lot of Hamlet out there floating around, looking like something else.
And I love Sons of Anarchy, but let's not pretend like the storyline wasn't derivative. Like,
Well, the funny part about when
it can
little
still be
aside,
good and be derivative at the same
the funny
time.
part is like I heard that and I was like, well, it can't be that obvious. And I was like, oh no, it's really obvious. But anyways, moving
Well,
on.
but you kind of like, but that's the interesting part about it is that you see a lot of these people that take these stories, repurpose the highlights, and then they turn it into their own thing, which is kind of the point about the discussion today is like, how do you, like what are some of the things you run into? What are some of the like challenges you can have? And obviously, how does that really play out for the experience that we've done it for so far? Because I at least feel like with us going through Age of Worms and us trying to find how these different fantasy D20 systems, the reason why it works, first of all, and reason why it feels like it's a lot less lift for me, is because the theme of these games are all fantasy based and have some, so I mean, so like it's not like I'm going, oh, well, I mean, I've been watching a lot of like Call of Cthulhu stuff on YouTube. So it's not like I'm going, oh, you have this entirely different premise for how the game operates and trying to force it into the Age of Worms. Because that would be a very different game of Age
Right.
of Worms.
You're not doing Delta Green Age of Worms campaign. No, you're right. That would be interesting. That would be an interesting conversion. But like yeah, somebody's like the NASA game. Somebody's like, it'd be
Mhm.
interesting to take the NASA game and make it a Delta Green game, and because it's a fantasy game.
or like taking something like Ryutama, or like a cozy game like Golden Sky Stories, and trying to
Yeah.
do Age of Worms, because Sky Stories doesn't have a combat resolution mechanic, and in fact, it eschews those types of things to say like you really shouldn't do fights in it. So how would you take the theme of that game, living in a small, sleepy Japanese village side,
Yeah.
into
Well,
play
Yeah,
it
uh,
off?
well, well, yeah. I think there's conversions that are definitely going to be ridiculous, like just not possible. But I think taking inspiration from
Mhm.
pre-written adventures is 100% something that's going to do. I think doing what you're doing, where you're taking a an adventure and converting it wholesale, like you're saying, oh, they encounter this monster, and then you're trying to convert that monster. Like if you're doing it frame by frame, so to speak, like that sounds like it would be hard to me.
And it can be, and it's actually interesting because like when you because there's two things that you run into with doing this, and this is what I've experienced so far, is that if I was doing something like D&D, because this is a D&D 3.5 adventure, and
Mhm.
most of these D20 systems, now have more modern feel and are based more closely to D&D 5th edition. So while a lot of the terms and stuff like that may be the same, we're already finding design principles into the game that just aren't really the way that we like to play, or the way that most modern games seem to be played. Because, I mean, like when one of the checks was DC zero search check to see if they notice X, and I'm like, DC zero?
yeah, that means that the players actually have to say that they're actively searching,
Right.
right?
Like,
Yeah.
I mean,
Or they
like,
don't get, or they don't get the information, and
Right. You have to give some indicator that you're doing something.
yeah. Well, and most players, when they go into a room, I mean, admittedly, the minutia, and we had talked about this with OSR, is that you guys don't describe the minutia of how you. Well, I enter the room. I start examining the stones for age of wear, tracks, dust settling patterns, possibly gaps, air that comes through the cavern, to
it's
see if.
too bad you didn't mention the temperature differential. You would have noticed the lava under the floor.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and I mean, like, I don't think that that's necessary, but I feel like just like something that's like a DC zero, like, I mean, if you, because sometimes the characters in like a D&D game, especially, because it's kind of like a thematic, like, oh, I tell you what's in the room, like they may be waiting to act, and then me going, okay, I read you all this stuff, and they're like, okay, well, we go around, search the room. That's all I had to wait for. Like I couldn't just expressly.
Right, and say that you notice that this is there. Like
I,
that's
I, I guess you might have players that are just like, no, we just walk straight through. Okay.
Interesting.
uh,
Next room.
when you're in a cave and if you've already been attacked by hostile monsters. How are you walking around? I don't know, staring at the ceiling with my thumb where the sun don't shine. You know what I
Next.
mean? Like, yeah.
Next.
Did anything
Next.
attack us?
Skip. like
Yeah,
like you just, when you're skipping dialogue in a
Yeah,
game or
like
something
yeah,
like that.
exactly. We skipped this
you're
cutscene.
you're scrolling the rooms like you're scrolling on a television, streaming
There's
service.
there's my
Nope,
short
nope, nope,
there's my
nope, nope.
there's my shorthand. Next time you I don't care about the room that you're describing. I skipped this cutscene. I press B. I hold B down.
Is there a quick action event that I can just get done with this?
Yeah,
But I mean, it does talk about like the resolution components to it, because the thing about playing it with these D20s systems is they all have, the D20 resolution roll high, and they're all using similarly themed ideas as to what you're trying to do. Now I had to work a little bit harder, I think, um when it came to certain things, like when you guys have to make a check, like for example, like there's no acrobatics check in distal. So how do you guys do something that relates to being agile and nimble? Well, that's, your agility kind of check.
You
um
don't. You
right.
just
or in
fail.
Brent's case, you just don't, and you you fail at
Exactly.
it. But there are mental checks, physical checks in DC 20 that you can kind of look at how that check could be used, and the intent of the
Right.
check is to make them do a certain type of action. And since those games support that type of thing, you can convert it without too much in the frame by
Yeah, they all
frame.
share a same. They all share the same framework. Like,
Hmm.
if nothing else, if nothing else in a lot of these D20 systems, you can always say it's an agility test.
Yeah.
Whether or not you're as good at it as you would be in the other system is another matter entirely. But you can
Hmm.
at least drill it down to that's what you want to do. It gets harder when you're doing it between systems. I think.
Hmm. Yeah, and the nice thing is that since they're all kind of using the same, and they're like kind of like descendants of a similar type of game, and they're all kind of taking it their own way. And I'm not trying to say that they're not unique or interesting in their own right. I'm just saying is that they're all using the same logical framework. It means that you go to a D&D 3.5 skill check, which, by the way, I was reading up on D&D 3.5 just to kind of understand the adventure. Apparently skill checks in D&D 3.5 wild, like just all over the place because of all the bonuses that they had. So like
Mhm.
if you say a DC like 16 check in that game, you have no idea if that's actually supposed to be hard or easy because checks were getting into like, oh, well, this is a
But
legendary check, so that's a difficulty
yeah,
52.
yeah, you had a lot. Well, the 3.5 was all about stacking bonuses. Like after a
Mhm.
while, that
Yeah.
was one thing people complained about. After a while, it didn't matter if somebody was attacking with a dagger because they just had so many bonuses to hit and damage, just
Mhm.
based off being who they were, not with what they were doing, like
Yeah.
wielding. So and it was the same with skills. Like if you had a skill monkey character, like a thief, who got like I think double the bonus every couple levels of their proficiencies, like they could do pretty much anything. They're just like
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, no, I remember some 3.5 games where like a DC, like
Mhm.
usually a DC 20 25 is tough. And in 3.5, maybe at first level it was still tough, but some of those characters had 8, 10s, 12s, to the plus and made it a reasonable expectation that you'd succeed.
yeah,
So I can see like the difference with the systems, where the two systems that we specifically played have very different modifiers.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? And so your roles are going to be different. And so if you don't understand in the base game how often you expect somebody to succeed, it's hard to convert that number for
Yeah.
the other games. And does it have to be perfect? No, it
It
doesn't.
it should be it
But it
just
should be
has to feel
close.
about right. Like
Yeah,
should this feel like an easy thing to do, a medium thing to do, a hard thing to do? And the nice thing about at least 3.5 is that because nobody has gotten truly wild, I think what would be really interesting is if we somehow manage to make it through 3 or 4 of the modules and we start getting to the higher level stuff and they're like, "Oh, a DC 40 check is required." And I'm like, "Is that supposed to be hard or easy or how esoteric is this knowledge?" you
well,
know?
depending on the level
yeah,
of characters, like 40 was hard. I think above a 20 was pretty easy between like 3 and 4, but above a 30 was
Yeah.
hard. And then once you got to like 5 and 6, if I remember right, like DC 30s, like you could
Mhm.
just you were pretty much superheroes in 3.5.
Yeah.
But
And so
but you were playing the character that you wanted to play at first level too. Let me point that out. You were playing a fighter the way that you wanted to play your fighter at first level.
yes. Brent has a unified theory for those of us that haven't watched every episode that in D&D nowadays in 5th edition you don't actually get to play your character until 3rd level.
Third edition, when you get your subclass, yeah.
at the
When you
3rd
can find
level,
when you can finally say
I'm
I'm me.
actually what I wanted to play in the first place.
I'm actually the
The
wild shape
the
druid,
20
not
the
just
20 hours of gameplay that we've had before this was
yeah,
me just
not just a druid that's bad at everything that I
hating my
wanted to
life.
do.
Well, and in truth, I mean, it's nice to have those tutorial levels for the people that need them, so it's fine. But yeah, so I mean, that's one thing I think is probably been the more challenging part is just trying to make sure you hit that sweet spot because obviously, like I think going to DC 20 had some I think it was lower bonus feeling than 3.5. You definitely
Yeah,
had a few different checks and all that stuff. But Distal definitely scaled it back even further
sure.
than what you had in
Mhm.
DC 20, and so much as that, I mean, really you only had a couple of stats that had modifiers above 1 if you were lucky. I mean, I think you Jeff had a modifier with 2, or was that Brent?
I've got a couple of things that I have a modifier of 2, but most of them are just 1.
They're just one.
Yeah, because you
No,
do get the
I do
proficiencies.
have a 2, but it's in something weird.
Yeah. And so like you're really getting at first level, you're getting a plus, +0 for many of your stat checks, +1 for something you're good in, +2 if you're legendary first level because you actually stacked your lineage bonus on top of your
Yeah.
discretionary point spend. So that +1 or +2 can really make a huge difference in your success for this particular game, which means that kind of finding that easy versus hard can be a little bit tricky. Um, But yeah, so I mean, that was the first challenge that we really ran into, and I think that you have to kind of apply the design principle too. That I've been trying to figure out how to make it so that you still fail forward. I like that, even though it's not been necessarily expressively talked about in this game and all those kind of things. If you fail forward. I coached myself in terms of like how I could have handled one of the reactions a little bit better in terms of our last session of Age of Worms. Even though you're using Distal, even though the failure happened, how to make it so that Jeff didn't have to kind of repeat himself and do that same thing over and over again. Because dice rolls should really only be a one and done. Because if you can do it
Yeah.
multiple times, have the result be what should
Yeah,
be
if I
what
can just do it till I succeed,
yeah,
then what's the point of making me do it
at all.
one time or 100
Right.
times, right?
Exactly. So how do you make it more dynamic? And so I coach myself a little bit on that, but also at the same time, I lost my train of thought, so we'll just end there.
What what have you found to be the most challenging thing moving between the systems? Like, is there something that kind of surprised you,
um,
or was it what you expected, I guess?
in terms of the surprise, monsters. I think monsters is where the challenge really, really comes from because of how different the combat feels between each of these systems and how the
Okay.
intent behind the combat goes with each of these systems. I feel like monsters are going to be my biggest challenge because I don't feel like when we went through character creation for DC-20 or Distal, like I don't feel like that conversion was hard. And in fact, I think you had as much fun putting together the characters in each of these systems because they were just unique and interesting.
Yeah.
But monsters, like for example, in DC-20, their balancing and stuff like that. I read some stuff. I went to the DC-20 Discord and kind of like read through some of the materials that they had and how you can balance these monsters and everything like that. But that was entirely different than how Distal presents monsters in terms of like behaviors and everything along those lines. Um, and so, like a lot of times, what I used to do when I had an adventure that I wanted to run that was from a different system, is that I'd either just replace the monster with something that existed in system. Like I would
Sure.
just take the monster out and put
Yeah.
something because why make it harder on myself if I already have a bestiary to
That
work
that
with?
no,
Yeah.
that seems the easiest.
Yeah. Take the monster out and put something that you're familiar with in makes the most sense.
But if there isn't something familiar in there, because like I said, DC-20 doesn't really have a bestiary established yet, so there wasn't really any monsters yet. Because it's in alpha status.
Right.
But DC-20 had a very small number of monsters in the bestiary, and none of them really felt close enough to what I needed. So like with that one, I actually did a little bit of remixing. I basically
Okay.
just took the template for how the monster is built and tried to use the principles that he used to design the monsters, and then just stole abilities that seemed really close to what I wanted, and kind of only went a little bit. That left me with very little extra work I had to do. But because I don't know how deadly the system is, that's why that lurking strangler died.
Well, in fairness, I did get a crit, and then I did roll pretty decent on the damage. Like,
Yeah, you
And
did.
he did kill the shit out of the sconce first.
Fuck, that Scotch was dead.
you give me a spell that I can arc off of a piece of metal in the room, and I'm going to arc it off a piece of metal in the room.
No, that was good. That was good. That was creative. And I think yeah, no, I think that's the thing, is I think that's what you're usually gonna have a problem with, is like skill challenges you could probably figure out, but it's like monsters that are gonna be the problem.
Mhm.
But
And if you're more drastically switching between systems, like you're gonna have to restat them almost wholesale if there's not something available.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting that you said that, because like just when I'm like poking around on Reddit or looking at stuff, because I haven't done a lot of conversions myself, like
Mhm.
very few that have ever seen the light of day. I've done some, like in the background where I thought I might run a game.
Sure.
But when you look around, I mean, there's a lot of people that aren't happy with their favorite system, whether it's D&D or something else.
Mhm.
Not to pick on D&D, but sure, why not? They're the biggest.
Well,
They
they
can
have the
take a
most
few
published
punches.
adventures too, I think.
Well, they do,
Right.
but there's a
Yeah.
lot of people that aren't happy with how some of the combats feel, with how
Mhm.
some of the combats flow, with how some of the monsters are statted out. So there's a lot of GMs out there that are literally, even if they're making their own thing, they're creating their own,
Mhm.
like stat block. They're using the monsters from, like, say, the monster manual if it's D&D, but they're statting them up and making them the way they want them to play so that the combat feels better for the players and the GM. Like I see a lot of people doing that, and that's not even across system, that's within system. So I guess it makes sense that would be a struggle.
A lot of times what happens, you see in D&D 5e2 is you see people reskin monsters. Like they'll change aspects of monsters because people know the monster manual. Like they've read it and they're like, oh, that's a whatever. It's got this many hit points and it does this.
Get out your silver weapons. Get out your silver weapons.
And like, so it's hard to avoid the meta. So people do that too. They can convert the monsters in system, which is weird too. But yeah,
and that's where games that's where supplements like Flea Mortals, would really help people, is because it's basically like an idea generator for all these different systems, and so much as that it allows you to create more dynamic monsters with different abilities or enhanced feel to them, that isn't just your standard like, oh, I'm a goblin with a scimitar.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because if I was going to buy a D&D supplement, Flea Mortals is probably on the short list, but not because I'd want to use it with D&D, because I'd want to use the concepts with whatever game I happen to be running.
No, and I think kind of to piggyback onto that, that's really what a lot of the older, instead of just converting wholesale like we're doing, and that big potential headache, because like you've taken on a lot of work to do that, because that's a lot. Because like what I was gonna do is I don't remember what it's called. I never remember what it's called, but there's a really early module from regular D&D where the player characters find a spaceship, like a literal honest to God spaceship. And like, it's in a fantasy setting, but it's like it's a spaceship, and there's like blue and red keys and everything like that. And I was going to convert that over to Troika. One, because Troika is a really super simple system, so it shouldn't be that hard. But like, that book was just a wall of text, and I was just like, I can't read this. I have a hard enough time. I can't read this to convert it. Like, there's just so much. It was like 2 columns with like tiny print, and I was like, there's no pictures in this. It's just text.
1,200 words a column.
Yeah, and like that's hard. Like, so I give you kudos for doing that, because like the conversions can be really hard. So I usually take inspiration from them, not try and convert them wholesale.
But it's true though. Like I actually, one of the things I had done a little bit of research on was just like how it feels in systems. And this is for people that listen to this, if you haven't checked out One Shot Adventures, you should check out that channel. The dude is like on point with a lot of the stuff that he has for his recommendations on how to play games and all that stuff. But he actually did something about a year ago that was really interesting, is that he basically said, like, can you survive as Shoggoth? And he took 3 systems in which he simulated combat against Shoggoth, an eldritch creature, because his 3 favorite systems are Call of Cthulhu, 5th edition D&D, and GURPS 4th edition. And so basically he ran the simulation, he basically had a computer program. He didn't really, open the hood and like explain how the simulations worked. What was that battle show on FX where they were like
Deadliest Warrior?
We didn't get to break it down Deadliest Warrior style, but what he did is he kind of set his parameters. He kind of explained what he was doing, how he was arriving at the parameters that he was using and stuff like that. And what was interesting is Call of Cthulhu, like, you had these World War II, military units that were fighting against the Shoggoth. They had rocket launchers, some grenades, some rifles, a bar. And it was like, after 100,000 battles, because that's how many it simulated, what do you think the survival rate in Call of Cthulhu was?
I'm assuming 0.
It was like 1.2%. Now,
wow.
Well, close to 0.
It was close to 0, because literally it was like, okay, well, the rocket launcher got off, and like some other
and there's no real stats for like Cthulhu and there might be for a Shoggoth.
There's stats for a Shoggoth. And admittedly, like, I mean, in Call of Cthulhu, there's supposed to be things that you don't really kill. So really that 1% represented them getting the perfect everything through
about as lucky as a human can get.
Yeah, exactly. So don't bank on it being your players, but also obviously it doesn't take the variability of players into account, like, because players could come up with some solutions that would be outside of the parameters he said. Then he took 5th edition. What do you think the survival rate on 5th edition was?
5%?
25%.
0. because the comparable characters that you create with Call of Cthulhu that are first level versus a 5th edition first level character, like they just couldn't even do damage to it because the conversion because literally he was
Oh,
using
that
the
makes sense.
conversions
Okay.
between the two, and like I guess the Shoggoth regenerates like 20 health a turn, and
You just can't do enough damage to overcome
yeah,
it.
and using some of the modern rules that he had used from a 5th edition supplement, it unfortunately he kind of described that they just got the gun rules wrong because you couldn't like unload a clip into it or do any of the things you could do in GURPS.
There's no
Not
right.
GURPS.
There's no explosives. There's no sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you would have to literally level them up, but then
Mhm.
so that basically meant that you would take these guys, they could fight the Shoggoth, but then if they fought the standard soldiers in this scenario, then they would have been like overpowered and all these other things. So it was a interesting comparison. But then you got to GURPS. How do you think they did in GURPS?
I don't even want
Ooh.
to think about the math of a GURPS game, frankly.
It's a lot of math, but I would say probably 50 to 75%, somewhere in there. Like
It was actually like it
coin
was a lot
flippy.
better. I think it was, oh gosh, all of a sudden I forgot the exact number, but
That's
I
okay.
think he said it was 50 because like rocket launchers in GURPS had like an impact damage, an explosion damage, and it blew up. Like, I mean, like apparently the way weapons work in GURPS was so much more like damaging to the Shoggoth that it actually gave them a chance.
Well,
So
yeah,
I,
because it's more simulationist. So they're trying to treat the Shoggoth like GURPS is trying to treat the Shoggoth like a real monster, like a real
yeah,
animal, and it's trying to treat the shells and stuff like real shells. Like,
like
well, it would
real
do
Right.
ammo.
yeah, like it would do an impact damage, and then the explosion would cause damage. Like, and that's one of those things. GURPS is pretty simulationist usually, so that makes sense.
No, it
Yeah.
does.
So I just thought it was kind of an interesting way to look at it. And I'm just looking at the video right now to see if what did it say? 70%.
70.
Yeah, but obviously during that 70%, like it wasn't 100% survival rate for the soldiers. But yeah, I was surprised because like, and that's when I think that really represents how the combats play differently between System 2. And it was an interesting kind of thought experiment that he did because that's kind of the challenge you run into is because that lurker in D&D plays differently than the lurker in DC-20 than it does in Distal. And each one
Right.
of them presents that because like the lurker could have literally killed Jeff, you know, by shooting him with an I-beam, knocking him unconscious, and then strangling him to death while Brent's like, hey, is everything on okay
Are you
over
okay
there?
over there?
Glad we separated the party. This made sense. We could search both rooms faster.
Super good idea.
Super good idea, guys. You know,
Way to
I
use that
mean,
teleport that you don't have anymore.
yeah, way to really get out of the party's reach. But I think that it was an interesting way to demonstrate how creatures, especially in this 5th edition game, can really present challenges for the conversion because they can just feel
Sure.
so much differently between games. And that's just simply because these are so adjacent to each other's. Whereas like I was looking at something and somebody was talking about like they wanted to play a pre-made game for Fabula Ultima. And I know we played Fabula Ultima, and if you guys remember kind of some of the design topics that were included was that it was a really hugely collaborative game between the game master and the players.
Mhm.
And the story was supposed to be kind of emergent story because you guys were
Right.
contributing a lot
Yeah,
as
together,
well.
all of us were creating the story, coming up with
Mhm.
the huge overarching plot and what the world looked like
Yeah.
and how
Well,
some things work.
but even through play, you guys should be uncovering more about the world and
Right.
advancing the plot. And then the GM really, their job is to manage monsters and dungeons and stuff like that that you guys possibly need is, or you know what I'm saying,
And
dungeons
maybe
or
course correcting is necessary.
if well, I mean, but maybe not. You know,
Hey, that might be the
so
one game we didn't wander off track.
we were pretty focused on that, which was amazing. But
I
it
meant us as
basically,
the players, not you as the GM.
but I was just saying, but that's also I feel like I railroaded you a little bit to make you go on target for that one. Go to A, go to B, go to C. You're done.
Oh, which one? The one that we did on the stream?
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
yeah. I mean, there was some agency, but not as much agency as maybe I.
Well, towards the end, we were trying to wrap it up and move on to the next game. You know,
Well, and we were. I mean, I don't know. I think it was fine.
yeah,
it was good.
I thought it was good.
Yeah, check it out. And if you guys like what we played on Fabula Ultimate, honestly, it's one of my favorite more recent. It was one of my more favorite recent games of just kind of branching out from D&D and having a fun time playing something that was different. But it's like, how do you convert something to Fabula Ultima, which it's like modus operandi is to basically not conform itself to a
Right.
standard adventure.
Yeah, in that case, you would take like things out of the adventure if it fits with what's going on. You'd take
Mhm.
things out of the adventure as just like plot hooks or
Yeah.
monsters or something like you couldn't convert that wholesale.
Yeah, you
Um,
you and it would be even hard to use like a skeleton for it, honestly, because you would
yeah,
literally, you might be able to take the hand of the adventure, but you wouldn't get necessarily the heart of the adventure, which
right,
Right.
exactly,
maybe not what you want. So,
right,
but that's just my thought. I mean, honestly, I think that those are the two main areas of conversion that you really have to focus on is like, A, how well does the setting fit with the theme? Like how well do they all theme?
Yeah.
B, how do you kind of resolve things like skill checks, et cetera, and C, the monsters or like how do you make the monsters feel like they should or at least feel interesting enough for the
right.
adventure that you're doing. So I think those three good topics, honestly. I
Yeah,
mean, you guys
I had a quick question for Brent,
Mhm.
because you said that you haven't converted something wholesale like that, but I know sometimes when you GM, you're pulling story ideas from other games or other places and pulling them into your setting. Like, just I mean, quickly, what kind of challenges that we maybe haven't touched on?
What I usually do is what I can use for an example is the Over the Edge game that we played on stream. That was actually started out as a cyberpunk one shot that somebody had written. And basically, what I usually do is I just take the bones of it and strip it down to like the story idea. Like the story
Okay,
idea being they did this job, they want to get the money. There's a meet in the alleyway. They go to a warehouse. Like that was the basic like bare bones
okay,
of what I took out of the adventure, and then I filled it in with like stuff within theme, but for the new game, but stuff that was drawn from the other thing. Like the phone call happened in the cyberpunk adventure, the ambush happened in the cyberpunk adventure, the
Mhm.
encounter at the warehouse happened in the cyberpunk adventure, but the content of those things were different. Like
okay,
it was like I think it was like police officers in the cyberpunk adventure, and it was way more combat heavy. Like it was like a
Mhm.
shootout. And
that would
then
make sense in Cyberpunk, though.
yeah, and then the warehouse was sort of the same thing. Is you met this gang, and there was another shoot, or you could choose how you decided to go in,
Mhm.
like you guys did. But like if the but and then there was mechanics that they had in. But so that's usually what I do is like I see an adventure and I say, oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And then I say, what about that can I use in
Okay,
the
Mhm.
setting that I want to use it in? And then I just strip it down to its base
so you're
parts
you're
and
grabbing like
fill it in there.
story beats. You're
Yeah.
ba boom, ba boom,
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Because
Okay,
that's how I kind of design when I design one shots or campaigns or whatever, like that's how I do it is I skeletonize it.
mm,
And then the reason that I only have a skeleton at any one point, one shots you can flesh out a little bit more because they are going to be more directed because usually in a one shot it isn't a sandbox. Usually it's I have a story, you guys are interacting with the story
mhm.
that I'm telling because that's the
sure.
nature of a one shot. But like if it's a campaign, I usually just skeletonize like I leave it more skeletonized with like hooks in it, and then I can adapt to what the players want to do within that
Okay.
framework, either branching off or whatever, so or relaying it back and stuff like that. That's usually how I do it.
Yeah. No, and I think that's and in truth be told, I think that's probably the smart way to go about it. So unless you were really like, because like I said, we're kind of shooting for a specific thing here with the
Mhm.
converting of the adventures and everything like that,
Right,
which is
yeah,
why we're
it's different, yeah.
yeah. But I think in general, like that's probably the safer way to do it is to take the story and apply the story to whatever setting or game system that you're probably doing, and that's going to be much safer. Because I think that you've seen in general people try to convert systems to settings, and I mean Dark Sun is my favorite example of people trying their best to keep Dark Sun up to date with D&D, but it's like a
Mhm.
fan project. I think is it like Dark Sun 3.5 didn't exist if I recall, but Dark Sun
Not
4 did.
not in a Hasbro, not in a WotC published
Yeah,
form
like I
anyways.
don't think it
Right.
existed in 3.5. And if it did, I'm sorry. I do remember it existed in AD&D. And then
No, they did 3.5, they released a Dungeons and Dragons, the magazine
oh,
Dungeon
the
and the magazine
magazine, the
Dragon,
conversion of the
and they
magazine.
did put out a rule set for for Dark Sun in that, but that was way towards the end. Like they did that, and then like 4th edition came out like months later.
Yeah, and 4th edition had a small attempt at Dark Sun, but it definitely didn't receive the same fanfare that its original box set did.
Well, it's a hard sell when you remove a lot of the flavor from Thri-kreen and then just say half giants don't exist. They're Goliaths now. That's going to be a hard sell for the fan base. So,
and then Dark Sun 5e just doesn't exist, and it's like that it's.
And they're not going to do it. They've pretty much said they're not going to do it.
No, there's challenges with as much as I think I like the setting almost as much as you guys do, but there are problematic elements in that setting.
So, but if you're curious, there is a 5th edition player's guide and everything like that people have worked on that have kind of tried to keep the spirit of Dark Sun, but made it relevant for the new game. And I think those endeavors are really cool too, because it does take.
Yeah, it is. That's a very large scale. That is much larger than adapting for like one party to go through one story. That's trying to update the entire world. Which is cool.
And I think that's something you need to be aware of too. Like there are adventures that are going to be harder to shoehorn in a setting. I think that's one thing that's kind of interesting about Distal is it's very setting specific. Like when we talked about Rel, like you said, it's kind of written to be played in the setting of
the world of Distal, yeah.
So like unless you're stripping it back a little bit more, it's a little bit harder to shoehorn some of the philosophical ideas of the campaign setting into the one shots. So that's something else to be aware of. A trap you can find. You can be like, this is such a cool idea, but like it would be real hard to put some Dragonlance stories in like Forgotten Realms just because like the culture of magic is so different and the knighthoods are so different and things like that. So it's it's more work than you think it's going to be to make the story beats work.
But it also does make me curious if we wanted to try Daggerheart in this Age of Worms thing and we put it in there, how well would it put itself? Because it is a high fantasy type game. It's just
how much work do you want to do?
Yeah, how
much? That's what I was going to ask myself.
How many walls do you want to slam?
Because I mean, you have to convert a dice mechanic then, and that can even be even more. Work. That can be a lot of work.
It could be. So I should probably either do that or put it in Kettle Obscura, see what happens there. Just kidding.
I think at some point we revisit Daggerheart, but we do it with some of what they've written. I don't.
Yeah,
it depends. If you really want to take it on, man, then I'm not going to stop you. But
more power to you.
I got nothing but. I don't know.
You don't have time. Don't act like you don't.
You do not have time.
So, okay. Well, that being said, we hope that people enjoyed the conversation today. We're going to wrap it up there. Honestly, there are so many good adventures for so many good systems. Sometimes it feels like a waste to have them just sitting on the bookshelf gathering dust when they could be converted, or at least inspiration for new
for sure,
or systems and stuff like that. So we're curious, like what adventure, published module, or whatever you want to call it, do you guys have on your shelf that you feel doesn't get the love and you'd like to see it end up in another system, or what adventures have you converted to what success? Let us know your stories. Put them in the comments. And Jeff, if they want to reach us another way, how can they do that?
They can find us on Facebook, Threads, or Twitter by looking for @rolewise. Or they can email us, rollwiseguys@gmail.com.
And one other suggestion is always read your one-shots before you try and play them with your players, because there are things that you're going to have to change in them, regardless of how well they're written. And as always, roll well, roll wise, and be safe out there, everybody.
Thanks.